The year is 23 AD, and the marble floors of the imperial palace on the Palatine hill are vibrating beneath your feet, caused not by an earthquake, but by the roar of the Roman mob surging against the gates below, while you stand in the center of the most expensive cage ever constructed by human hands, draped in a tunic of saffron, yellow, the traditional color of a bride. But to you it feels less like a wedding trousseau and more like the winding sheet of a sacrifice waiting for the knife, because the air in the cubiculum is heavy with the scent of burning cedar and stale fear, and you know what is coming when the sun finally sets over the Tiber River. This is not a celebration of romance or the coming together of two souls in love. This is a transfer of deed of biological audit and a high-stakes political maneuver disguised as a marriage ceremony where the players are empires and the pawn is your body. Before we descend into the terrifying reality of what happened behind the closed doors of an imperial bedroom, I want to ask where in the modern world you are listening from, because it is startling to realize that the ruins we visit today were once the stage for these sophisticated nightmares. So please leave your location in the comment below to help us map the reach of this history. We are looking at the zenith of the Roman Empire, a civilization that conquered the known world with legions and laws, yet engineered a domestic hell for the women at the very top of its social pyramid. The girl shivering in the flickering light of the oil lamps is a pawn in the ruthless game of dynastic chess played by the Julio-Claudian dynasty, where bloodlines were the ultimate currency, and the womb was a mint that had to be secured, guarded, and strictly regulated. While history books often focus on the senators debating in the Curia or the gladiators fighting in the Colosseum, the true machinery of the empire was often greased in these private chambers where a distinct form of psychological and physical torture was normalized under the guise of tradition. The door to the chamber is heavy oak reinforced with bronze, but it cannot shut out the reality that you are being watched, because Roman architecture in elite households was not designed for privacy. It was designed for surveillance, as recent analysis of the ground plans of aristocratic insula and imperial villas reveals a disturbing lack of seclusion, with sightlines deliberately cut through walls and servants' quarters positioned to turn every intimate moment into a spectator sport. The young bride, often no older than 14 or 15, has been groomed for this night, not with advice on intimacy, but with terrifying warnings about duty and the lethal consequences of failure, knowing that the shadows in the corners of the room are not empty. The concept of privacy was alien to the Roman elite, especially for royal women whose bodies were considered state property, and tonight that property is scheduled for a mandatory inspection. The terror gripping her is centered on a single object placed prominently on the bed, which is a pristine sheet of Egyptian linen woven fine and white, and this fabric is not for comfort. It is a forensic tool, a document of proof that will determine whether she wakes up tomorrow as an empress or as an outcast destined for exile and death. Under the draconian statutes of the Lex Julia de Adulterize Coercendis passed by Augustus to enforce moral purity, the virtue of a noble woman was a matter of criminal law, and the expectation was absolute biological virginity, and the proof required was blood. It is difficult for the modern mind to comprehend the sheer weight of this pressure, where a natural physiological variance could be interpreted as treason. Ancient medical treatises, such as those written by Serenus of Ephesus, reveal a clinical obsession with the physical signs of virginity, yet they possess a tragic misunderstanding of female anatomy, because we now know that the hymen is not a standardized seal that breaks and bleeds on command. It is a membrane that varies wildly between women and can be altered by athletics, injury, or simple biology, meaning that millions of innocent women were biologically incapable of providing the sanguine evidence the state demanded. But in the ruthless calculus of Rome, absence of evidence was treated as evidence of guilt, which is why archaeologists and historians have found references to a dark underground trade in the bridal black markets, where terrified aristocratic girls would procure vials of chicken blood or small distinct bladders of fish blood to conceal in their hair or beneath their fingernails, preparing to stage a crime scene to save their own lives. If the sheet remained white, the morning inspection would unleash a catastrophe involving the matrons of the family, and potentially court physicians scrutinizing the bedding for the color viscosity and smell of the fluids to verify the consummation, and if the bride failed this test, she could be instantly repudiated, her father's political alliances shattered, and her own person subjected to the island exile where starvation or forced suicide with common ends. Even as she passes the test, the night itself is structured as a ritualized assault because the Romans celebrated the rape of the Sabine women, not as a tragedy, but as a foundational myth of their civilization, a story where the abduction and forced marriage of neighboring women was framed as a heroic necessity reenacted in the wedding ceremony itself through the ritual of the Raptio, where the bride was required to cling to her mother's arms and scream while the groom and his friends forcibly tore her away. It was theater, but it was theater that reinforced a brutal legal reality known as Manus, where the woman passed from the authority of her father to the absolute authority of her husband, becoming legally indistinguishable from his daughter or his property, having no standing in court, no right to her own financial agency, and no right to refuse his demands. The psychological conditioning of the wedding day was designed to break her will before she even entered the bedroom, and as the couple was locked inside, the chamber of torment did not cease. Because the crowd outside did not disperse, instead, they began the fescennine verses, which were crude, obscene, and raucous songs shouted at the top of their lungs by the wedding guests, detailing the sexual acts taking place inside, mocking the bride's fear and shouting instructions to the groom to dominate his new possession. The noise was intended to drown out any cries from within and to ward off the evil eye, but its primary function was to strip away any dignity the bride might have left, reminding her that her body was a public utility, and this auditory assault could last until dawn, ensuring that the trauma of the night was accompanied by a soundtrack of humiliation. Once the sun rose, the ordeal shifted from the sexual to the reproductive, because the sole purpose of a royal wife was production of male heirs, and the clock began ticking the moment the marriage was consummated. In the absence of modern science, the Romans relied on a mixture of superstition, dangerous herbalism, and misogynistic theories to manage fertility, placing crushing pressure on a new empress to conceive immediately. If she did not swell with child within the first few months, the whispering campaigns would begin questioning if she was barren or cursed, or rejecting her duty, leading palace physicians to descend upon her with treatments that sound like torture to modern ears, including fumigations with toxic sulfur pessaries made of wool, and irritating spices, and potions containing lead or mercury that slowly poisoned the very system they were trying to stimulate. The desperation producer son led many high-ranking Roman women to engage in the terrifying gamble of the changeling plot, where if a pregnancy was faked or if a female child was born and secretly swapped for a male infant purchased in the slums, the queen was committing high treason. The historian Suetonius and others hint at these conspiracies, which were driven by the terrifying fact that a woman's worth was zero unless she produced a son. To secure the succession, yet the greatest horror was not infertility, but success, because to become pregnant in ancient Rome was to step onto a battlefield with a mortality rate that rivaled the legions on the frontier. Without knowledge of bacteria or sterilization, childbirth was a lethal lottery where puerperal fever, often called childbed fever, waited in the unsanitary instruments of the midwives and the unwashed hands of the physicians. We have recovered letters from Roman women that read like last wills and testaments written as they approached their confinement, because they knew there was a 1 in 5 chance they would never hold the child they were bearing. For a queen who was expected to undergo this process 5, 6, or 10 times to ensure a spare heir survived childhood, the cumulative probability of death was staggering, as she was walking into fire over and over again, driven by the dynastic needs of men who saw her only as a vessel. The tragedy of the arranged political marriage was that the bride often knew nothing of the man who now held the power of life and death over her, because in the Julio-Claudian era the emperors were frequently deeply disturbed individuals warped by absolute power and constant paranoia. A young girl might find herself locked in that chamber with a man like Tiberius, whose sexual predilections were whispered about with shudders of revulsion, or a volatile sadist like Caligula, who might decide on a whim to have her tortured or executed simply because he was bored. Even the good emperors were a product of a patriarchal system that viewed empathy as weakness, and there was no escape mechanism because Roman law made divorce easy for men, but socially suicidal for women. To leave a husband was to lose your children, your home, and your protection in a society that preyed on the vulnerable, which is why we have found archaeological evidence of protective magic hidden in the graves of elite women, amulets, inscribed with curses against abusers, and prayers for deliverance, suggesting that their only defense against the violence of their husbands was a desperate appeal to the gods of the underworld. The emotional toll of this systemic abuse is hard to quantify, but we can see the cracks in the marble when the histories mention royal women who descended into madness, who stopped eating, who fell into strange melancholies, or who became ruthlessly cruel themselves, perpetuating the cycle of abuse on their own daughters, because it was the only way they knew how to survive. The transformation from the trembling girl in the saffron tunic to the hardened matriarch was a process of scar tissue formation, and the woman, who survived the wedding night, the public humiliation of the songs, the invasive medical exams, and the terror of childbirth, was no longer the same person. She had been forged in a crucible of trauma designed by the most civilized empire in history, and it is a haunting paradox that the civilization that gave us concrete aqueducts and the legal code also engineered a domestic culture of such profound cruelty. When we walk through the ruins of the Palatine, today we admire the scale of the walls and the beauty of the frescoes, but we rarely think about the eyes that watched from the secret passages or the cries that were drowned out by the cheering crowds. The wedding night was a seal on the warrant of their captivity the moment the door locked and the mask of the empire dropped to reveal the cold calculation underneath. These stories were not written in the history books by the men who lived them. They were whispered in the slave quarters and hinted at in the frantic letters sent between sisters, and by unearthing this narrative, we are breaking the silence that was imposed on them 2,000 years ago. The cheering crowds have long since turned to dust, and the torches have burned out, but the reality of that saffron tunic and the white sheet remains a testament to the endurance of women who live their lives as hostages in their own homes. The history of Rome is written in blood, but not all of it was shed on the battlefield. Much of it was shed in the bridal chamber, hidden from view, but no less fatal. The next time you see a depiction of a Roman wedding in a movie or a painting, remember the invisible architecture of surveillance and the crushing weight of the law that stood unseen in the room, because this was not a romance. It was a survival horror story where the monster was the society itself. But the story does not end when the sun rises, because the morning light only illuminates the bars of the cage more clearly, and the new bride discovers that she has not just married a man, but has been acquired by a corporation known as the Julio Claudian dynasty. The sheet has been inspected, the elders have nodded their approval, and the transaction is complete, yet the terror is far from over, because now the machinery of the Roman state turns its grinding gears toward the management of her daily existence. The formidable figure of the mother-in-law, or Socris in Latin, was not just a trope of comedy in the ancient world. She was often a warden of the younger woman's virtue and the enforcer of dynastic policy, like Livia Drusilla, the wife of Augustus, who set a terrifying precedent for control of female behavior within the imperial family, implementing a network of informants that made the palace walls have ears. A young bride entering this environment quickly learned that her jewelry boxes where searcher letters were intercepted and her friendships were vetted for political risks, living in the golden cage of the Roman Matrona, a position of immense theoretical honor that came with practically zero personal freedom. Money was the iron bar that kept the door locked, because the Roman dowry, or dose, was a massive transfer of wealth from the bride's father to the husband intended to cover the cost of her maintenance, but it functioned as a sophisticated hostage negotiation. If the marriage failed, or if the husband decided to discard her, he was often entitled to retain significant portions of this fortune for the upkeep of the children, or for moral failings. He might invent meaning that a woman who fled an abusive marriage faced not just social stigma, but absolute destitution. The legal framework surrounding her property was elaborate, designed to keep her dependent, and while some women under the legal status of sine manu retain control over their own inheritance, and practice the pressure to hand over financial management to a male tutor or guardian was overwhelming. But what happens when the pressure becomes too much to bear and the walls close in and the husband is a tyrant and the laws offer no recourse is where the history of Rome takes a turn into the shadows, and we find the secret weapon of the desperate, which is poison. The ancient sources, including Tacitus and Cassius Dio, are filled with whispers of Aninum, the silent killer, that could level the playing field between a physically weaker woman and a legally omnipotent man. And it is no coincidence that the most feared criminal accusation against a Roman wife was poisoning. We read of figures like Locustus, the professional poisoner of Rome, who was not a criminal in the shadows, but a state asset employed by empresses to remove inconvenient husbands and stepsons. So a young queen pushed to the brink might find herself staring at a plate of mushrooms or a goblet of wine, wondering if this was the only exit strategy left. The fear of poisoning was so rampant that emperors employed food tasters or pregustator slaves whose sole purpose was to eat the royal dinner and see if they died, creating a psychological toll of a marriage where every meal is a game of Russian roulette and trust is a fatal weakness. Yet the danger did not only come from within the palace, it came from a very biology the state was so obsessed with controlling. Because the pressure to produce a male heir was not just about succession, it was about survival, as a queen without a son was expendable. The medical interventions to ensure a male child were bizarre and harrowing, involving consumption of wolf, meat, the wearing of testicles from various animals as amulets, and adherence to astrological charts that dictated the precise hour of conception. And when these methods failed, as they inevitably did, the blame landed squarely on the woman. The phrase "she did not give him a son" was a death knell for her status, and if she did conceive, the physical ordeal of pregnancy in the ancient world was a 9-month march toward potential death sentence. Skeletal remains from Roman sites show women with pelvic deformities caused by rickets or malnutrition, even among the elite, which made labor agonizingly difficult, and the tools available to physicians for a difficult birth were nightmarish, including hooks and knives used to extract a fetus that could not pass, effectively sacrificing the child to save a mother or sometimes losing both. The infant mortality rate was so high that perhaps 30 to 50% of children did not reach adulthood, meaning a queen had to endure this trauma repeatedly just to ensure one heir survived to inherit the purple. The grief of losing a child was another emotion that had to be performed according to state rules, because excessive mourning was seen as a weakness, a lack of stoicism that reflected poorly on the emperor. So these women were forced to bury their infants and return to their duties with dry eyes and a composed face while their hearts were breaking. This emotional suppression was a key component of their training, as they were statues in public and prisoners in private. But what of the women who refuse a break is where the history of Rome is also the history of female defiance, often punished with the ultimate weapon of the state, which was exile. The map of the Mediterranean is dotted with tiny, desolate islands like Pandateria and Jairus that serve as open-air prisons for royal women who cross the line, like Julia, the elder, the daughter of Augustus, who was banished to a windswept rock where she was denied wine and luxury and forbidden from seeing any male visitors. These islands were the dumping grounds for the empire's problematic women, where a queen who committed adultery or who was merely accused of it to facilitate a political divorce could be shipped off overnight, her name erased from public monuments, her statues toppled, and her existence effectively terminated while she was still alive. The psychological isolation of exile was a fate many feared more than execution, because to be a Roman was to exist within the social web of the city, and to be cut from it was a form of social death. Yet even on these islands, the long arm of the emperor could reach, and soldiers were sent to assist these exiles in suicide if they became too politically inconvenient, with the command to open one's veins being a euphemism for a state-ordered execution disguised as a voluntary exit. This was the final reality of the Roman royal wedding, where the bride was not just marrying a husband, she was marrying the state, and the state had the power of life and death. The marble columns of the Palatine that looked so majestic in the sunlight were mute witnesses to centuries of this silent war. And the young girl we imagine at the start trembling in her saffron tunic was entering a battlefield where the weapons were laws, rumors, poisons, and wounds. It is a testament to their resilience that any of them survived at all. And when we look at the statues of women like Agrippina or Livia, and we see cold, imperious faces, perhaps what we're seeing is the armor they forged to endure a world that wanted to crush them. They learned to play the game better than the men who wrote the rules, building networks of loyalty among the slaves, hoarding secrets, manipulating succession, and sometimes striking back like Agrippina, the younger, who managed to elevate her son Nero to the throne through sheer force of will and political maneuvering, only to be murdered by him in the end, a tragic coda that perfectly encapsulates the brutal cycle of Roman power. The story of the Roman royal bride is not a romance. It is a horror story of survival that challenges us to look past the glory of the legions and the rhetoric of the Senate to see the human cost paid by the women who were traded like cattle to secure the peace. As we leave the year 23 AD behind and return to our modern lives, let us remember that the echoes of their struggle are still with us because the dynamics of control, ownership, and the policing of women's bodies did not vanish with the fall of Rome. They mutated and survived in new forms. By telling their stories, we engage in a form of historical justice, giving a voice to those who were silenced by the scratching of the scribe's pen and the roar of the crowd. The next time you see a piece of Roman jewelry in a museum, a gold snake bracelet, or a pearl earring, do not just see a pretty object. See it as a piece of armor worn by a soldier in a domestic war who fought her battles in the bedroom and the birthing chair. The ruins are silent, but if you listen closely to the wind blowing through the arches of the Palatine, you might just hear the whisper of a name, a prayer, or a curse from the women who lived and died in the golden cage of the empire.